Good morning again, Hope Lutheran Church. Pastor Dan here with the next lecture on our series concerning the history of Israel and its main characters. Today we are moving on to finish the story of Moses. You might remember from our last lecture, if I recall properly, we talked about Moses' calling. He had fled Egypt after the murder of one of the slave drivers, and married the daughter of Jethro, who was the priest of the Midianites, who, by the way, the Midianites were apparently descendants of the people of Abraham's second wife. So there's a connection there. The significance of that connection, I can't tell you. I have no idea, but apparently that's the story. Okay, so Moses is living a nice life there out in the desert of the Sinai Peninsula. He is a shepherd. He's taking care of the sheep. One day he sees a burning bush that doesn't consume itself, and this is God, of course, and God calls Moses to become the person who will lead his people out of slavery in Egypt on to the Promised Land. Now, it's been a long time since God gave this promise to Abraham, this threefold promise upon which the entire story of the Bible is based, the unfolding of this promise. And so you might remember that goes all the way back to probably just after the year 2000 BC. And we are now in the 14th century, 13th century. Anyway, this is a long time. And they have been the children of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, have been slaves in Egypt for some 400 years and have not had any kind of relationship with God to speak of. However, God tells Moses, I've heard their cries and I am going to free them from slavery. And you're the guy who's going to lead them out. Moses, of course, has a lot of excuses. He's like all of us. Whenever we're given a tough job, we don't want it. At least I don't. But when God chooses you for a particular job, you're better off taking it than not. And eventually God convinces Moses that it was a better idea to take the job than not. God does give Moses a helper, his brother Aaron, who's going to help speak for him. So off they go to Egypt. And when he gets there, he says, I want to meet with the Pharaoh. Well, the Pharaoh's not particularly interested in meeting with Moses. Why would he want to meet with Moses? He doesn't care about Moses. But in any case, he sees him. Moses says, let my people go. Pharaoh finds this amusing. Are you out of your mind? By the way, Pharaoh's involved in expansion of his military at this point in time, and he's building several military garrisons, and he needs the slave labor. So not only does he dislike the Israelites because he considers them enemies, remember he enslaved them in the first place because he thought they were a security threat, but he needs the slave labor to build the installations that he's involved in building. And so, no, I'm not going to let these people go. Get lost, Moses. Forget it. You're out of your mind. This sets off a conflict between God and Moses. Now, most of you are aware of the fact that the conflict was one that worked itself out through several plagues, 10 to be exact. And I'm going to look those up. I don't want to go into detail into each one, except to say that many of these plagues were not unusual in Egypt. I mean, to have an infestation of gnats or frogs, or and even the Nile River would turn color at times because of sediment or whatever it was. So, in any case, not all of these plagues were all that unusual. However, they were extremely difficult to deal with, and they put a heavy burden on the Egyptian people and on the Pharaoh himself. In any case, like I say, there were 10 of them. And what this represents really is a contest between God and Moses. You might ask yourself the question, why doesn't God just do something, amazing and get those people out of there without having to go through 10 plagues? I think there might be a couple of things going on here. I'm not sure. But I do think that God is, you see, Pharaoh considers himself a god. And so he sees this as a contest between himself and the God of the Hebrews. And he doesn't necessarily think that he's the weaker of the two. So he's going to take on this contest. And so God is involved in making sure that Moses himself, Pharaoh himself, understands who God is and who God is not, namely him. He's not. And secondly, the Hebrews themselves, once this thing is all over, they're going to have to follow God through the wilderness all the way to the promised land. This is going to be a very difficult journey. It becomes, the model, so to speak, for spiritual journeys from here on through. Whenever people think of spiritual journeys, they think of the Israelites traveling through the wilderness onto the promised land. And all of the tests, and a test, from a biblical point of view, a test is a situation where the people's faith is challenged. It's not a situation where God is tempting them to disobey. That's a temptation. Jesus teaches us to pray that God would not lead us into temptation. God does not lead us into temptation. But that's not to say that God doesn't provide tests and not to play games, but in order to strengthen our faith. So if you go through a hard time in your life and you rely on your trust in God throughout this difficult period, whatever it might be, by the time things are resolved, your faith is going to be stronger. It's going to have grown. You're going to be closer to God than you were before. And that's the whole point. That's what he wants. Okay, so he does send tests. And this trip through the wilderness involves all kinds of tests. In fact, the first generation of Israelites, most of them are not even going to make it to the Promised Land. It's going to be the next generation that gets there. Okay, back to the plagues. Now, Pharaoh, as I say, says no to Moses. So God tries a number of things. There's an infestation of frogs, gnats, flies. The livestock are diseased. There's boils. There's hail, locusts. That wasn't unusual. I remember as a kid growing up in North Dakota, sometimes I would spend summers out on my uncle's farm, and we would go out into the fields, hiking somewhere or hunting gophers or doing whatever, and locusts were everywhere. They're hopping up, and, as soon as you took a step, 10 locusts would hop up in front of you. So they were everywhere. And then there was a period of darkness where there was no daylight for a period of time. Now, one thing about these plagues, that people have had a hard time understanding, including myself, is that the text says that after each plague, God hardens Pharaoh's heart so that he will not let the people go. In other words, we're left with the question, well, had God not hardened his heart, may he have let them go after this particular plague? May this have been enough? We'll never know, because God hardens his heart. In other words, he works on Moses or on Pharaoh such that Pharaoh absolutely, positively refuses to let these people go. And apparently God is involved in this decision. So it's not just a matter of Pharaoh's free will deciding that he's not going to let them go. God is involved in making sure that Pharaoh says no. Why would he do that? Well, again, this is a contest, okay, to determine who is God and who is not. And I think that God wants to make sure that everyone involved who witnesses what goes on here understands who has divine power and who does not have divine power. And one way to do that is to keep it up, keep the contest going. So that's what he does. He hardens his heart, he says no, and then we move on to the next one. Okay, the last plague is the death of the firstborn. Now, this is the most important one, and this is the one that leads to the most important festival in the Jewish year. It's called the Passover, of course, as you probably already know. The plague was that God would send the angel of death upon every household, and for the Hebrews to be protected from having their firstborn killed by this angel of death. What they had to do was first slaughter a lamb, put blood from the lamb on the doorposts of their house, and then they would have a meal. The meal consisted of the lamb, unleavened bread. They didn't have time to wait for the bread to rise, so it was unleavened. Bitter herbs. The bitter herbs symbolize the bitterness of slavery. Each article of food in this Passover meal has symbolic value. All right, so in any case, the angel of death appears, and the firstborn in every Egyptian household dies, including that of the Pharaoh. And that was enough. Okay, that was enough to finally convince him, I need to get rid of these people. These people are nothing but trouble. They're not worth it. I'll get slave labor someplace else. I'll get my military garrisons built in another way, whatever it was he thought. But in any case, he had enough. So after the death of his firstborn, he summons Moses and Aaron and tells them, clear out. Get your people together and get out of here. Okay? So that's what they do. They begin their journey. They get everything together, and they're ready to start their travels all the way to the land that Abraham originally was promised by God that his descendants would inherit, and there they would settle and establish a kingdom, and they would be God's own people. That's the history that we are going to be covering when we finally get there. Okay, so off they go. The problem is there's a body of water that separates where the Israelites are from the Sinai Desert. Normally called the Red Sea. It's the Sea of Reeds is what it is. And there's no way to cross that. So here's the first test, right? Here they are. They're on their way. They're filled with hope. And they run up against this body of water. They can't cross it, and they're stuck. On top of that, Pharaoh changes his mind. He decides that he doesn't want to let these people go after all. So he picks his best charioteers, his best fighting men, and he assembles his army, and he pursues them. And so there they are between the Sea of Reeds, which they can't cross, and Pharaoh's army, which is rapidly approaching. And of course, what do? Well, whenever people get into trouble of one kind or another, they expect their leaders to figure out how to solve their problems. And so they go to Moses. Moses, you brought us out here to die in the wilderness. You know, we're not going to be able to cross this body of water, and we've got all of these Egyptians after us. What kind of a leader are you anyway? Now we're all going to die. But God has a plan, as usual. God tells Moses that he's going to separate the water. And so he sends a high wind. The wind separates the water in the sense of creating a path that they can pass through. As Moses holds up his staff, and he waits as the Israelites cross through the path and on to the other side of the Sea of Reeds. Now, the Pharaoh's army isn't going to stop pursuing, okay? They're going to continue. They can see what's happening, and they decide, well, if they can get through there, we can get through there too. So they pursue, and onto the path they go. But at that point, God decides that he's going to stop the wind. The wind dies down. The water begins to return back to where it belongs. And because the Pharaoh's army is in the middle of crossing the Sea of Reeds, when the wind dies, they all drowned as the water recedes and comes back to its original place. So there you have it. The miracle of the crossing of the Sea of Reeds. The people of Israel are now on the other side. They're in the Sinai Desert. And they have a party. There is a song of celebration. They celebrate. The Song of Miriam is famous. It's only a couple of verses. Goes like this. Then the prophet Miriam, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and with dancing. And Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea." Okay, so, well, at this point you would think the people of Israel, that their faith was strong and that they were ready to go now, and that they could pretty much handle any further tests that might come their way. But if you think that, you would be wrong, because the next test comes almost immediately after that. they need water, and unfortunately, they don't have the water they need. So what do? Well, they do the same thing they did the first time they had a challenge. They go to Moses and they complain, saying, and the people complained against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? He cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood, and he threw it into the water. The water was bitter, and the water became sweet. And test number 2 has been successfully navigated. Okay. I'm just going to talk about a couple of more that they have on the way. All right, the next one comes in chapter 16. The Israelites once again are having problems. The whole congregation of the Israelites set out from Elim, and Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. So they hadn't been gone all that long. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Apparently they don't have enough food. These people are amazing. They're saved again and again and again from their problems, but it doesn't seem to help many. I mean, it doesn't seem to result in enough faith to believe that when the next challenge comes along, certainly God is going to figure out a way to see to it that they get what they need. Well, actually, this particular one is rather instructive for this reason. When there are big changes in our lives and we go through a hard time, the past always seems better than it really was. Okay? We think about the way things were in the past, and because we're having trouble in the present, we think, oh, how nice it was back then when we didn't have this problem. Tell me about it. Yeah, slavery was great, living like slaves, and we got really great food back then. You know, I'm sure the food was barely edible, and yet what they remember is that they sat by the flesh pots and ate their fill of bread. I don't think so. But that's what they remember. That's what your memory does to you when you have trouble in the present. The past is always better than the present when the present is a problem. So they complained to Moses. God provides them with food in two different ways. There is a natural process in the desert whereby this flaky substance is formed in the dew of the morning on the plants in the desert. And if you go out there before the sun comes up and melts it, you can collect this stuff and you can turn it into some kind of, makeshift flour that'll allow you to create a form of bread. So that's what they do. It's called manna, and they are instructed to go out and collect just enough for each day. In other words, God is saying to them, okay, I'm going to feed you people, but one day at a time, because I want to teach you how to trust. I want to teach you how to trust me. So you get one day at a time. Don't try to collect more than what you can eat in one day, because it's not going to work out. It'll spoil, and so it's one day at a time. But it's also springtime, which means it's time for the migration of birds, and so the quail are coming through, and so they've got birds as well. So they've got the manna, they've got the birds, the quail, and they've got all kinds of food. Okay, so challenge number 3 solved. Yeah, they make it. Okay, well, now certainly they have enough faith. Now they're going to be able to go the rest of the way with all kinds of faith in God. God saves us every time. Why should we worry? Why should we ever question God's faithfulness to his promises? Clearly, God is faithful when he promises that he'll do something. He does it. We've seen that again and again and again. We have all this evidence for God's faithfulness. Why should we doubt? Well, it doesn't work out that way. All right. So when we get to chapter 17, we have the next test. From the wilderness of Sin, the whole congregation of the Israelites journeyed by stages as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. The people quarreled with who? Moses, of course, their leader. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." They're making demands. You would think he was dealing with a bunch of adolescents here. Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us with our children and livestock with thirst?" So Moses cries out to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord said to Moses, "Go on ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. I will be standing there in front of you on the rock of Horeb. Strike the rock and the water will come out of it, so that the people may drink." Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. He called the place Massah or Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Well, there's a question that's probably God hears quite often. Is the Lord among us or not? I mean, after all, I'm going through all of this trouble in my life. I'm thirsty. I would like to drink this Coke. Thankfully, I have one. But if I didn't, I might ask the question, is the Lord among me or not? So, typical of human nature. Faith is hard. Faith is hard because we are asked in the midst of situations where we don't know how a problem can possibly be solved to trust in the one who does. Okay, when a child is in a situation that is causing fear and the child is helpless and can't get out of whatever difficulty the child is in on his own, the child is going to be terrified, okay, and scream out for his or her parents. And we're the same way. But that's how faith grows. Okay, now hopefully over time, we learn that God's promises are trustworthy, that we can rely on them, that we can take risks based on those promises. That doesn't mean the risks aren't going to feel risky, and it doesn't mean they're going to feel comfortable, and it doesn't mean that everything is going to be necessarily hunky-dory, but it does mean that God is there, God has a plan, and God will guide and strengthen you and get you through it. This reminds me of a passage in the Apostle Paul. I forget which one it was. But Paul is talking about everything he's had to go through as an apostle. Shipwrecks, prison, beatings, arrests. I mean, he's been through it all. And what he's discovered is that God was with him the whole time and enabled him to continue to do his work of spreading the Christian faith during that first generation of apostles, where the church was planted in the 30 years after Jesus' resurrection. That is what ensured the success and growth of Christianity, those first 30 years. And those apostles went through what they went through would make the things we go through seem like child's play. Most of them, if not all of them, with the exception of John, were martyred. We don't know what happened to some of them. We know James, son of Zebedee, was the first to be martyred. That was John's brother. We know James, Jesus' brother, was thrown off the pinnacle of the temple and then stoned. We know the deacon Stephen was stoned. We know that Paul was beheaded. He was fortunate enough to be a Roman citizen, so he didn't have to go through the shame of crucifixion. Peter, on the other hand, was crucified, but by then, Peter loved the Lord so much that he said, I am not worthy to be crucified in the same way Jesus is, so crucify me upside down. They complied. And that's the way Peter's life ended. And all of this happened in the mid-60s AD. We don't know exactly what happened to Thomas. He may have ended up in India. We don't know for sure. But there is some evidence to that effect. Thaddeus, Bartholomew, some of the others, we don't know what happened to them. But in any case, these people followed, the call of Jesus, their Lord, and were willing to face death itself to serve his purposes and his plan for their life. And if they had not, there would be no Christianity. There would be no religion, which to us seems as if it's shrinking and disappearing, but it's not. It's growing. It's growing rapidly in other parts of the world. In the West, Christianity eventually, unless we have some kind of a renaissance of faith, some kind of rebirth of faith here in the West, we're so affluent in this part of the world that we have other gods now. We have golden calves that we worship instead. But in other parts of the world, they have no such thing. And Christianity is growing rapidly. Christianity remains the most diverse religion on the face of the planet. People of every race and cultural origin are Christian. So, it's growing so rapidly in China that those geniuses who run the Communist Party are now starting to have to try to figure out how they're going to have to deal with this in the future. So, I hope I'm alive to find out what happens there. Anyway, speaking of the golden calf, by now we are to Mount Sinai. Now, if you have a biblical map, and I know I'm going overboard here, but I've got to get going with this lecture or we're never going to get, even into the history of the kings. So I will go as fast as I can. We are, if you have a map, a biblical map in the back of your Bible, most Bibles do, it'll show the probable route of the Exodus, which is south. They went south. They did not go north along the sea because there were Egyptian military garrisons there. They never would have made it through. So they went south through this country that was indeed dangerous. It's no wonder that they had problems with food and water because this was a desert with an average rainfall of maybe an inch. I'm not sure, but not much more than that. And when they reach Mount Sinai, God is going to put on a show. In other words, God is going to reveal himself in the sense that God is going to appear on top of the mountain in a cloud, in a stormy cloud. And he's going to ask Moses to come to the top of the mountain to get the terms of the covenant that is going to be the document that serves as the foundation of their relationship with God from here on through. Okay, a covenant is an agreement. We talked about the meaning of this earlier. Okay, now it's time to make the covenant, the Mosaic covenant. There were, remember, I think I mentioned, there was the covenant made with Noah, which was just a plain old agreement on God's part not to destroy the earth by flood again. There was the covenant with Abraham, where God simply gave him these 3 promises. And all Abraham had to do was follow him to the promised land. Now we've got a covenant that's going to be made with Moses, and later on there will be a covenant that is made with King David. That will be the covenant that relates to the birth of Jesus Christ. In any case, the people gather. They can't go on the mountain because if they do, they will die. So stay off the mountain. And Moses trudges up to the top to receive the terms of the covenant. And what he receives is actually, we usually divide it up into 2 separate forms. First, the 10 words. They aren't called the 10 Commandments. They're called the 10 words. Okay? And then there is the other 603 laws that go along with the 10 words, the commandments. All right? The commandments are the moral foundation for everything. The rest of the laws, there's a number of different kinds of laws. Some of it's case law, where, for example, suppose somebody has an ox, and oxen can be unpredictable, and they sometimes gore people. And if your ox is out of control and gores somebody, you are held responsible for what your ox does, and it tells what it is you have to do. Okay, that's like case law. And then there's other laws where it just says what would happen if somebody does X, then Y. Okay, so there's those kinds of laws as well. But we're going to focus on the 10 words, okay? Notice, and I will be taking a break after we finish this part. Notice that the 10 commandments start out not with a commandment at all, but with a statement of God's grace. In other words, with a statement of what God has done for them. This is all based on the notion that Christianity is grace, Judaism is law, is bunk. Okay, Judaism is also grace. So, God says, I am the Lord your God. And who is that? Who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Okay, so that's who God is. God is the one who saved you from slavery. God is the one who freed you. God is the one who led you here to this place. God is the one who provided water and food along the way. God is the one who gave you victory against the Amalekites when they attacked you on the road to Mount Sinai. This is a God of mercy and grace and love. And God is going to give these 10 words or commandments in order to teach the people how to live a healthy life. In other words, it's no different than a parent and children. We teach our children behavior that's going to bring blessing to their life, not curses. And it's the same thing here. If you want to live a healthy life, if you want to create a community that reflects the fact that here is a people whose faith is in God, the one who created and gave them life, this is the way you're going to behave. This is what your community is going to look like. Okay? What follows then are these 10 commandments. Now, different bodies of the church, as well as the Jews for that matter, number them differently. But Roman Catholics and Lutherans and Eastern Orthodox number them the same. Some other Protestants number them differently, Reformed, Anglicans, and other Protestant traditions. And then the Jews also have their own ordering. But in any case, for us Lutherans, the first command, for all of them for that matter, the first commandment is, you shall have no other gods. In other words, there's one God, and even though human beings behave as if there is a myriad of gods, and that it's almost a smorgasbord out there of gods that we can worship, and worship, of course, means giving your heart to, serving something that is the most important aspect of your life, something to which you give yourself, something without which life would be meaningless. That is your God. Luther, in his explanation of the commandments in the Large Catechism, explained that God is the one in whom you put your faith. That is your God. So if you put your faith in power, I love being a powerful person. I just really get off on that, and losing my position of power would be the greatest disaster in the world. I couldn't live without it. Well, if that's the case, power is your God. Or if it's wealth. You know, I've worked hard all my life. I have now enough money to live the way I want to live, and I can do as I please. And if the stock market crashes and I have too much money in that stupid thing and I lose it all and I have to sell my house, buy a small condo and eat hamburgers and broccoli, instead of going to the French restaurant and ordering duck, well, life isn't going to be worth living. Well, if that's the case, then money is your God, okay? It's like the young man who came to Jesus and said, how do I inherit eternal life? Well, Jesus knew his heart. He knew who he worshiped. So he said to him, sell all you have, give it to the poor, and follow me. In other words, you can't have two gods. He said that too. You can't serve both God and mammon, so you have to choose. And unfortunately, this young man at this point in time, we don't know, it may have happened later, may have changed his mind. One can hope. But at this point in time, he walked away sorrowfully because there was no way he was going to be able to give up his wealth. So that's number one. Okay, there's one God, and you worship that one God. Now, your heart, as a human being, was created to worship this God. If you worship something else, you become a lesser being than you would be if you worship God instead. Okay? Worshiping God means receiving also God's gifts of divine mercy and love and forgiveness. Forgiveness from the past so that we can grow and become new people. Strength to handle life's difficulties. Hope so that irrespective of how bad things can get in this world, and recently, who thought we'd be dealing with a pandemic? Well, apparently some people knew it. I didn't. Never even crossed my mind. But here it is. The point is that to receive the gifts of God is to receive the gifts that enable you to develop into a fully functioning, spiritually healthy human being. If you worship something else, then you will not develop into that. You will become a slave to that, whatever it is. And if that's the way you want to live your life, that is your choice. But commandment number one is that there is only one God. So if you decide to substitute that God for something else, that is your choice. But it ends up in things like what's going on in our country right now when people don't worship God, when they worship other things instead. We end up with a society that doesn't know how to do the things that bring people together. What's going on in America right now? Tribalism. An inability to forgive people for the mistakes they make in the past. Somebody's Twitter feed is somebody discovers that back when they were 16, they made a racist remark. Well, that disqualifies them from, any kind of a job now. We can't allow people like that into the fold here. That person's out. People's lives are being destroyed. People don't take into account the fact that there is such a thing as redemption, that people can change for the better. When you don't have those things, not only is it going to harm you as an individual, it is going to tear your community apart. Because communities, human beings, are never going to be perfect. They are never going to always say the right thing or always do the right thing. And if there's not forgiveness, and if there's not the possibility for redemption, and if there's not people who are willing to love irrespective of whether the person does the right thing or not, such as we heard in the Sermon on the Mount, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Most people would laugh at that at this point in time. But that's how communities that are healthy are created. Otherwise, forget it. You don't have a chance. Okay, it's been an entire hour, and it's been a pleasure being with you. We will finish the 10 Commandments next time, because I want to go into some of them in some detail. There's a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to some of those commandments. For example, honor your father and your mother. Well, does that apply primarily to young children and their parents, or does it apply primarily to adult children of elderly parents? Well, it applies to both, of course. But back in those days, there wasn't a big problem with little children doing what their parents wanted them to do. But there was a problem caring for the elderly. So back in those days, that was the main concern. Okay, so we're going to go into some of that. And until then, I hope you're all well. Wear your masks. Observe social distancing. And stay well. Okay, see you next time. Bye-bye.